Well, this is so instructive that you're not going to believe it. But I have been trying to get to New Zealand for a good part of my life. There was a reprobate Bradlee in Boston about at the turn of the century who got a girl in the family way and was exiled by his father first to London, and with $50,000, and he whistled through that and came back, and his father then took him to Australia, where he settled, and he seemed to have he was a slave to booze, not to put too fine a point on it, but it was banished by his keepers, which was a law firm in Wellington, to Chatham Island, which you know and I don't, but is hell and gone from here, and the last time I checked had a population of 701. Anyway, he, with a boat every 3 months, he was pretty much out of the way until everybody arranged for him to buy a place. He got married, had no children. His wife remarried and had no children. And anyway, the deed to this place drifted back to Boston and was given to me as I set sail for the Pacific in World War II on a destroyer. And I had the deed I carried in my little hot cot bed, and actually we're about 50 miles off of New Zealand en route for R&R when we were ordered to go up to Saipan and Guam and Tinian, and that was the end of that adventure. But I had one war story to tell you, which was that there was a moment when we heard, and I was the CIC officer, which was where all the radios and all that junk came in, and you gave it out to whoever needed it. And we heard 4 voices singing Waltzing Matilda with a strong emphasis on the last line, and we've discovered that they were a New Zealand fighter squadron, and were able to direct them to a friendly field, and they thanked us and disappeared. And I got put in for a small medal for this, which was turned down because nobody knows whether it was true or not, and that included us. We didn't know whether it was true or not. So that story may be true or may not. Anyway, I'm on a little bubble of notoriety that's that this Watergate story was. You think how long ago that was? My God, how can it still have a half-life? But it does. It was quite. It hurt me for a while to know that that was the best thing I ever did in my life, and it was in 1974, 37 years ago, whatever the hell it was, 30-some years ago, 32 years ago. But there it is. It happened, and the idea of it that I did nothing else in my life, or that I've done nothing since, has it's a small wound, but it's still there. There were 400 Watergate stories. It seems hard to believe, 400 Watergate stories. We had a comparatively new owner and publisher, the great Catherine Graham, who was an extraordinary person, and it was such unbelievable fun. I mean, it's impossible to tell you what a good time we had doing this, and how early on we got filled with a confidence that we were right, and that we had this sort of built-in, if you had designed somebody to be on the opposite side of a newspaper, you choose Richard Nixon. I mean, he was just made to order for us. And we had a few ups and downs, but I remember when Woodward came to me towards the end of this thing and said, he talked with a very Midwestern Chicago accent. What would you say if I told you that they had taped everything And I would say, I would think that's a goddamn lie. It couldn't possibly be true. Nobody is that dumb. And then, by God, he turned out to be right, which he has a knack of doing still. And so, I mean, it was towards the end, the summer of 1974, it had a sort of an air of a feeling of inevitability. We were going to get him. Yeah, he was going to go, not just us, because by that time the rest of the press was very much onto it, and there was a lot of good reporting by other newspapers. But I was so scared that at the end, that last day, when we had been told that he was going to resign, the first person who told us that he was going to resign was Barry Goldwater, who is not your ideal Washington Post source, or nobody would think, although he was quite a wonderful man, and he couldn't stand Nixon. So, and he was a great friend of my wife's mother and father. So, toward that last month, I think I had to drink with him every night at my in-laws' house, and we really had that scene taped. I tell you, we had it. And when it happened, after the 400th story, the idea, I became overpowered with the idea that we were going to screw it up on that last day. That in those days we were still on hot type. Our relations with the printers were not perfect, to say the least, and we were scared that somebody would just stick in an impossible line with bad language in it, or the F word or something like that. And but we've finally survived that. There's a picture of all of us sitting around that the stones, on what they called stones then, reading upside down and backward, just every line going like this, see if it could possibly be the F word or possibly be some terrible word. And anyway, we got it out, and that issue was over. We went on and started looking for other stories. But the Post is it had this incredible ownership. I've always been interested in owners because they make good newspapers. If you don't have a good owner, you don't have a good newspaper. And Catherine Graham had an interesting life. She was her father was enormously wealthy and had bought the paper at auction for $600 or $800 and some $1,000, and lost over $1 million a year for the next 30 years. And then Phil Graham, her husband, who was this mercurial, attractive man who was also a manic depressive, took his own life, and there she was deciding whether she was going to run a newspaper or sell it, or take a throne somewhere on the 7th floor and be the titular only. But she was much more than that, and we developed a bond that is quite extraordinary. And she was in the city room, on a normal day 4 or 5 times a week, and certainly always when she left the building at 6:30 or 7, she'd come down to check on what the hell we'd have it. I would like to read it, didn't want to hear it, wanted to read it. And that kind of interest and that kind of support was so exhilarating. So I've done a little since then, but that was the best day I ever had, and we went on to there were 4 papers when we started in town, and there's now really 1.5. The Moonies have a paper which has cost the Reverend Moon $1 billion, and they have a circulation of about 100,000, and I don't know who the hell reads them, but and I don't care very much. What are you interested in that I could talk to you about? I'm very high on O'Reilly. He is the most, among other things, I hope you get a chance to find this out. He is bar none the best mimic I have ever heard. He does more accents, and they are, at the drop of one belt, he's got a story, and the stories are always in dialect, and they're really, they're hysterical. And he's great company. This board that I'm on, I hate to say it too loud, but its mission has been largely accomplished. It was founded in when he bought the South African, a group of South African papers. First, I guess he bought it all, but he worried that about how a new white owner would be welcomed by the new black Mandela government. And so he decided, he asked me to go on this board whose job really was to describe to the Mandela people, not Mandela himself, but the people around him, about the virtues of a free press, and then to describe to the new editors and reporters, the value of an independent government, and for God's sakes, let's give them a break. Don't put them all in jail the first week. And I think that mission has largely been accomplished. We have the board is really quite interesting. There's some very bright people on it. There are only 3 Americans on it. There's quite a few Irish on it, but there's some very interesting Brits and some, and the three blacks on it from South Africa are fantastically interesting. I don't think we have we're here to learn. None of us know anything about New Zealand or damn little about Australia, where we head next week. But so part of the thing you have to do is educate me about the paper. What can I answer for?
Ben, can I ask just one quick thing? You mentioned Catherine Graham's daily kind of involvement as publisher.
Yeah.
Or awareness as publisher, what editorial was doing.
Well, she never asked me to take anything out, and I gave her an early test of this once when she had asked me, the advertising department of the paper, who didn't talk to me because they hadn't taken my measure yet to see how I would behave. I gave her a picture of some grocery store owners who were seeing somebody in the Congress, so that the standard picture, they get on the steps of the Capitol, and a lot of dumb faces that from so far away you can't see who the hell they are. But asked me if she said, don't run it, but she said, they've given me this to give you, and I said, sure. What the hell? I thought we'd bury it, put it somewhere, and nobody'd ever see it. And the next day I saw her, she said, thanks a lot. And I'd completely forgotten about it. And I didn't willfully not run it, I just didn't run it. And then it would look dumb to run it the day after because, they weren't there yesterday. Anyway, she just was interested in newspapers and what the hell was going on. And every now and then we'd have a lunch in which she'd say, are you sure you're right, in some form of that question. And it was so impossible to imagine that it was a perfectly good question. If you wrote that, you wouldn't have believed it.
The reason I asked that is that you're quoted, I think, by Ken Orletta in one of his books, saying that the guy Wills, who took over the LA Times, who tried to sort of blend commercial and editorial functions. Yeah. What the quote of yours was that you didn't like the thought of him because he didn't feel that he was trespassing in a newsroom. Is that something that you think needs to be felt, not perhaps by Catherine Graham and your experience, but elsewhere? Is there a problem with that?
Well, yeah, I think the presence of the owners, you've really got to have your head examined if you're going to forbid them or try to forbid them. It's their house. When Catherine was succeeded by her son, who is, he's now 60, but he is bar none the best qualified owner. He's been a reporter. He was delivering papers when he was 12 years old. He's been a reporter. He's been he volunteered for Vietnam, unlike the rest of his, his age group was really all against that. He's held every job in the paper. He sold ads. He's delivered papers. He's was a reporter. I got myself in a terrible jam with the sports section. It was run by some old type who was impossible to get along with, and I figured myself as a sports expert, so I went swaggering in there and decided that we had to change, and I named the wrong person as sports editor. It was a mess, and if it had been bad before I touched it, it was worse after I touched it. So I said to Graham, would you be sports editor? But before I checked with his mother, who was furious at me because she had it planned to go to Newsweek, which we owned, and learn that part. And Graham said, "Oh boy," and went in to be sports editor for a year, and straightened it out. I think her interest, you can't exaggerate it, but it was it wasn't passive because she was so involved, but it was non-interfering. And in the Nixon administration, she has a dimension of her that was a kind of leader of the best small s social scene in Washington. I mean, there's where you could find Supreme Court justices and congressmen and people like that, and a handful of reporters, and it was really good fun to go there. And when in the Nixon administration, it was very damn difficult to go there. She had a pal in Kissinger, which none of us really liked, because he was, we thought he was devious, but he was the only one who would come. Plus there was one cabinet member from the Secretary of Commerce, who nobody cared about, and he was allowed to come. But I think generally her parties, and she had a great big house, and it was a very friendly house. Generally that was the most fun in town, but it was a little slow in the Nixon years.
Talking about sources, did you know who Deep Throat was, and what do you think of his self-disclosure recently?
Well, I did not know who Deep Throat was until about 10 days after the president resigned. I can't believe that of me now, but it's the truth. It was known as Woodward's friend, and then the managing editor was an eclectic, interesting man called Howard Simons, and he finally christened him Deep Throat, and then we could refer to him as nothing else. I knew that he was high up in the Justice Department, and that plus the fact that every time that he was a source for a story, it proved out. Just made me drop my guard. I didn't, what the hell if he was going to be right every time? I didn't care what job he held. And I wasn't going to tell anybody. So it didn't seem important. I mean, that doesn't sound like me, and it's not really me, but I did it. Then it seemed to me right after the president resigned, there was a kind of a mood that I detected of inside Washington, of both the rest of the press and some of the elected officials that were poo-pooing it. He was getting too much publicity, Woodward was, and they said, oh, hell, he made it up. It was a composite figure. So I just thought that I had to know to defend the troops. And I took him out to a park. We sat on a bench, and it was all over in 5 minutes. I said, who is he? And Woodward said, well, he begins every sentence with, well. It's a guy called Mark Felt, which, you know, I knew of, but I didn't know him all that well. He was trying very hard to succeed J. Edgar Hoover.
Have you been a composite figure, as is the case?
I can't hear you, I'm sorry.
Had Deep Throat been a composite figure, if Woodward had told you that, how would you have handled that situation?
Well, I'm not sure I understand. I'm not hearing you right.
If Deep Throat was a composite figure, if
Yeah.
Woodward told you that, how would you have handled that?
Oh, I would have forbade it. You can't do that.
But had the information proved correct at that point?
I would still have said you can't do that. You can't tell the readers or imply to the readers that there is a single person source when in fact you don't have one. It's I mean, that can you know it wasn't true. Therefore, it's got no place in the paper. But it sort of captivated the country in a way that is I'm still stunned by. And then, of course, when Redford decided that he was going to make this movie and showed up in the newsroom of the Washington Post, you know, that the cat was out of the bag. Then, I mean, it was a very unsettling period for me because they first wanted to film in the newsroom, and they said, you know, we'll start filming at 3 o'clock in the morning, and we'll be out of there by 8 in the morning, and you know, we won't bother you, which was, you know, patently foolish. And we even insisted originally that he couldn't use the name Washington Post, and that he couldn't use any of our names, because you spend a long time building up a reputation of a paper and of a person, and then you turn it over to Hollywood. And that sounded to us like a terribly dangerous thing to do. But when our lawyers told us that we didn't have a leg to stand on, that we had become, for legal purposes, public figures, and that they could use the title, and they could use our names, and they were going to, on the theory that it's better to, if you can't lick them, join them, we started to cooperate. Hoffman especially was in the newsroom for weeks, and he developed, he just sort of sank into the woodwork. Actually, he looks a little like Bernstein, and he is a classic mimic, and he could imitate Bernstein so that he could call Woodward, and Woodward wouldn't know whether it was Dustin or Carl. The hero of that movie, as far as I'm concerned, was the director, a man called Pakula, Alan Pakula, who understood. He looked like Sigmund Freud. He had a beard, a very neat beard, and an extremely attractive guy. And he just got plain out fascinated by the business and by the people involved. And he studied us. My God, he knows all about my mother and my sister and what a fool my brother was when he was growing up, and you know, and he knew everything about all our families. And I thought, you know, it's hard to say, but I thought that was a pretty good movie. That it was fairly accurate about the newspaper business, except that the phones, when any reporter called anybody, he was always there. Was never told, I'll call you back. But I mean, that really, I didn't think that threw us off a little after a while. I mean, we were not public figures. especially the editors weren't public figures. Woodward and Bernstein wrote the book, then they suddenly started to do television, and I had stayed off television, and but you know, we became quote notorious, and there was not much we could. No point in whining about it. That was a fact. Yeah.
Was it a concern, because you didn't know the identity of Deep Throat, that you weren't able to assess whether he had an agenda or a motive in presenting this?
I'm having trouble hearing. I can't. Sorry.
Was it a worry to you that because you didn't know who Deep Throat was, you couldn't do your own assessment of whether he had a motive or whatever?
Yeah, it did worry me, and the reason that I stopped worrying is that he was always right. You really can't beat that. You can't ask more of a source. Well, one thing more than the truth is the name, but you know, if we had we think that we made one mistake in 400 stories. If that's true, I mean, I only know of one really big one. And we actually fixed that. I don't know how much you all know about it, but we said that there was a slush fund in the White House under the control of Haldeman, and it was $300 and some thousand, and our source was a man named who we said had so testified to the grand jury. And the following morning at, on the CBS Morning News, there was our source with a CBS reporter saying, the Post says, blah, 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 is that true? He said no. And we had a little attitude talk with Woodward and Bernstein as soon as possible, and they were flabbergasted. And what it turned out, it hung on just whether he had told the grand jury that or not. The fact turned out to be absolutely true, and in fact it was $700,000. But for 2 days there was an awful lot of, we told you so, and we told, it isn't, they were wrong, and we were, technically wrong, but he didn't testify to the grand jury, he told the Attorney General investigating, and not the Attorney General, the prosecutor. And so that's I think the only mistake we made.
And how well do you think the American media is covering the Iraqi war?
Well, I think better and better. I think they had it. They bought a pig in a poke there for a while, and
Think about the embedding journalists.
well, by embedding journalists, that works. Eventually, it works pretty well. But if you embedded if your embedded reporter got transferred to a different area and sent to the north of Iraq, where there was no fighting going on, you didn't have you were out of luck. That's being fixed slightly by the quality and capabilities of the communication equipment. I mean, you think of in my wars, you had to, you had to go to a filing point, and it had to be better than somebody's phone, and which generally meant that you had to withdraw from whatever front you were on, and then go somewhere. And I remember the first Israeli invasion of Egypt. We had to, when we were finished that, there was this. It didn't last very long, that war, but we had to go all the way back to France from Israel to file. The only place we could have filed was the French battleship Jean Bart, and we were worried that if we got on a French battleship, they'd say, well, here, give us your copy, and then, we'd get out of there and we wouldn't know what happened to it. So, but now they've got their own phones. I mean, we have reporters calling us from battlefields in Iraq. It's stunning. Let's just listen to them. You can put them on the Squawk Box.
What do you think of Time Magazine's decision to hand over?
Oh, well, that's happened since I left, so I don't know. This is Time Magazine making its reporter or okaying its reporter. to reveal the source of some documents. I think that we wouldn't have done it, but I think it's probably of less moment than I mean, I don't think that it's a huge victory for the government and nor a huge defeat for the press. It's sort of silly, it's punitive in a way, because everybody knew who the hell the source was, everybody knew the information, so I can sympathize with, I know the reporter very well, and I know he didn't want to go to jail, but the last I checked with him, he didn't want time to tell. I'd have to know a little more about it. I haven't.
He still didn't want them to tell, but the companies decided to hand over.
Yeah. I don't know. Now, did the New York Times didn't, did they? Or did they? Yeah. Well, I know Judy Miller quite well, too, and she didn't want to go to jail, I promise you. But it would have surprised me if she'd, I mean, if the Times had told who her source was, I think she'd have held a press conference and blasted them.
Your owner lived upstairs, ours lives in Ireland. I just wondered what the advisory board advice gives on sort of
I can't hear. I'm wrong. I'm sorry. Say it again.
I was just saying that your owner lived in upstairs, as it were, whereas ours lives in Ireland.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering where the advisory board, if it gave any advice on sort of control of papers in other countries.
Well, he's an absentee owner wherever he goes. He's an Irish citizen, but for tax purposes, he is only in Ireland 140-something days a week that the Irish law allows. And then he lives in Jamaica sometime. He lives in Chris O'Reilly, his wife, has got a horse farm in Normandy. He lives around, that guy. I mean, and he lives in a plane a lot. He comes down here to now. He's been here quite a lot. He's in South Africa once a year. We go for a week in generally in January 31st or February 1st, around in there. We go, if you want to know where the board it meets wherever there is a sporting event that O'Reilly is interested in. He's a former rugby player for the British Lions, so we knew when we heard we were going to coming here, we knew damn well we were going to New Zealand or Australia, but we didn't know which one.
The tail of that question was really perhaps what the advisory board offers in terms of journalism, I guess, or newspapers, or ownership issues of newspapers.
Well, we don't offer advice about the country, or it's. I mean, it would take a lot of brass for us to give him some advice about a country that we've only been in 48 hours. We now know a little about South Africa, but and we don't I wish we did more of giving him editorial opinions about the papers in the country that we are. Some of us are qualified to do that after a certain amount of time where I mean, I've got to read the Herald more than 3 times before I'm going to feel that, in fact, it's going to be 30 times before I give him advice about that. But I mean, what the hell can I tell him about how to run a paper in this country? Nothing is the answer. Yeah.
Given that most newspapers these days seem to be their biggest challenges is falling sales, and it does seem to be a sort of fairly long-term and persistent trend. What's sort of your thoughts on the prognosis for the industry itself?
Well, I don't know how qualified I am to answer this. I've only worked for one daily newspaper in my life, and I'm 84. There's a reason not to listen to me on this subject. I think it's true that the circulation of the big papers has fallen for the last 10 or 15 years, slowly. It's true that the television news audience has fallen faster than that. And there is this whole jungle of talk shows. I don't know if it's true here in New Zealand, but in America, my God, there's all news television, all news radio, all news talk shows. You have journalists. A journalist can't hold his head up in Washington if he isn't on television 2 or 3 times a week. So I think the news is getting out. I think that it's very hard to make a generalization about America, but I think the Washington Post is so much better a paper today than it was 40 years ago. Yeah, the budget, when I got to the Post, when I came back to the Post in an editor capacity, the budget was $4 million a year. I hate to say this out loud, but it's $90 million a year and climbing now. We have probably close to 900 editorial employees. There are people there who just don't write enough, don't write often enough. But I think if you have to put on a larger hat than an editor hat, your citizen hat, the end result should be to be sure that as many people know as much about current affairs as possible. And I think that job is being done much better today than it ever has been before. Now, the publishers seem to have solved this. They make more money every year, and how they convince the advertisers, I'm not sure, but the Post, for instance, has lost about for the last 10 years, it's lost about 1% a year, but it's got more sections, it's got more zoned editions, it's got more, really the reader is being better served. That's true in the New York Times. I think papers are cyclical. They have good editors and bad editors, they have good owners and bad owners, and that they go up and down. I think the remaining big papers, and there are far fewer, but I think they're a lot better. And I don't know, you are the authority on whether this paper is better today than it was 25 years ago, but I bet I know the answer.
What do you think of the trend towards the tabloid format?
Well, I'm not used to it, and therefore every time I pick up a tabloid, it has some slight strange dimension to it. The Washington Post started a morning paper some years ago, just to afternoon paper, excuse me, because we heard that someone else was going to do it, and we didn't want, there was some group in Toronto or Montreal that were going to do it, and we didn't want to have a vacuum there. It became quite successful. I mean, it's supposed to be, it's newsstands only, and it's downtown only, and it sells 140,000, 180,000 a day, and 5 day a week. And I'm going into, when I get back to the States, I'm going up to New York for a month, and I'm going to be reading the New York papers, 2 of which are tabloids, and I'll get used to it again. They're kind of fun, and I think the good ones are very brightly written, and they're forced to condense, which we don't like as reporters, and this I'm sure you don't like as much as some people would like. But
Do you think the quality for the big metros will eventually go that way?
You mean with tabloids?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think the other way. I think there's something about a broadsheet that gives me confidence that the people who are running it have they've got more space to play around with. They've generally got more column inches, and that you're apt to get a better deal out of it. But that's only a hunch. I don't know. Yeah.
If papers are better than they were sort of 20, 30, 40 years ago, is that down to better journalism now?
Say it again.
If papers are better than they were sort of 40 years ago or 30
Yeah.
years ago, is that down to better or different journalism today?
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you, when you find the answer to that, you can make $1 million in the United States very easily. I think it is, some of it is television. A lot of it is that readers are joining the subscriber lists at a later age, but they're also lasting longer. But I have a couple of sons. One of them was just 25 years in the newspaper business, and my youngest boy doesn't read. He doesn't read. He just damn well doesn't read, and he's 23 years old, and he says he looks at the front page occasionally, and I don't know how to fix that. You'd think that he would want to, with his father and mother involved in the business, that he would be more interested, but he says, "You'll tell me about it if it's important." Can't have that.
Do you have any active role in at the Post now?
Any extra roles?
Any active? Did you go in? Do you have an office? Do you?
Oh, I do. I go there every day. I mean, it's sort of pathetic. I open my wife opens the door in the morning, and out I go, and I come back at 6:30. I have an office and a secretary, and I've been described once as a stop on a tour of the Washington Post. But I talk to. I go down to the cafeteria. Most of the new reporters are, I have a chance to meet and talk to them, and every so often I talk to maybe the last 20 reporters hired, I'm still stunned that I will read a byline on page 1. I said, "Who the hell is that?" I have no idea who they are, and I think that's too bad, but I have a pretty good idea of what's going on there. I mean, this last Deep Throat thing, when Vanity Fair had this story, which incidentally I still haven't seen a copy of the magazine. They got it out so fast that they just sent Xerox fax copies to everybody. Both the editor and the managing editor were out, and it took them 4 or 5 hours to get there, and I worked on. I see Woodward much more than I see Bernstein, and I got a hold of Woodward, and we started talking about it. Woodward said at once he's so successful that he can be impossibly moral if he wants to be. He said that, I gave my word to Mark Felt that I would never reveal his name, and that still exists. Mark Felt has not told me that I am released from that oath. And I said, "Oh, for God's sakes, he has talked to the reporter who wrote this story, and so has his daughter, and that in effect it has been effectively released." And he finally agreed, but it's wonderful to be in a position to take us that high a moral position. But meanwhile, of course, he's writing a book about it. And when the guy who wrote the piece for Vanity Fair after the first week called Woodward up and said, maybe we should collaborate on a book together. And Woodward was able to inform him that his manuscript was in the Simon & Schuster office in New York as of this morning, and you know, it was too late. The train was leaving the station. But I mean, he worked so hard that it, and so he's on a schedule that he's writing a book or working at the Post or just, you know, 50 hours a day. Impossible.
How would you feel today if you were still editing the Post and you picked up one of Woodward's books and found revelations there that...
Oh, well, I've done that in Man and Boy often, but you know, in return, what we get is the first serial rights. We are the first people to serialize it. And also, if it's a really big story that he comes upon during the research of the book, the chances are it won't hold. So you can generally talk him into at least giving the readers of the Post a smell of the story. And actually he likes that because the first publication will increase the enthusiasm for his book, and it also will increase the flow of information. People will talk to him after they've seen it and said, well, you got that wrong, this. So that's it. Other editors like to ask me that question because to explain why we had the story and they didn't. And they say, well, you had it late. You know, well, you take it where you can get it, don't you?
He's been criticised for some of his most recent books because of the preferential access, like the White House, the suggestions of that, because he's had such access that he's sort of kind of tainted.
He has incredible access now. I mean, he's a goddamn institution. Shouldn't say. He is an institution. And when Woodward calls up the White House and says that he would like to, reveals to them that he's ready to talk to the president, you know, they'll say, well, what the hell? If we invite him, he's going to be, and he wants to see us, you know, those are pretty optimum conditions to talk to a source. He's not a revolutionary in any sense, Woodward. He's not a bomb thrower. He's an establishment figure. And so long as he has, you know, he's written one book on Bush already, Bush at War, which I think he had something like 20 hours mano a mano with the president in private. And you know, that'll keep him happy for a year or two. And then when he needs to be refueled, why, he's such a public figure now that fortunately very teasable. So you can prevent him from getting a swelled head quite easily.
Did you actually meet Nixon?
Did I meet Nixon?
Yeah.
I met him probably twice.
What did he say to you? What did he call you?
Not a hell of a lot. But in the middle of on alternate weekends, he called me up Saturdays, and 2 Saturdays in a row. And Saturdays at the Washington Post is a very, especially in the morning, is very informal because the wives have generally insisted that you take the children today. I'm sick of it. And so there are a lot of kids running around, you know, Xeroxing their hands and doing, and one of them came up to me and once said that it was the president wanted to speak to me on the phone and had no secretary because it was Saturday. And I figured it was, you know, a pal, Art Buchwald or somebody like that, and it wasn't. It was the President of the United States. And, hi, Ben, how are you, like this, as if we were friends. And he talked about his war, which is, I found to be a very odd subject because he didn't really have much of a war record. He was he was part of the price fixing administration. I think he was in the Navy, and it was uncomfortable, and he didn't seem to, I couldn't think of what I had to tell him, and he just went on talking, and then he ended up by saying that was been great, and let's do it again, and by God, if he didn't call me the next Saturday. And at the end of that, it was over. That was the last word I ever had from him. And I wrote a book of memoirs, and I tried to see him then, and he wouldn't see me.
What does it feel personally like to be involved in something that's changed history? How does that affect you personally?
Well, it's hard to put that cast on it for me. I mean, I consider, you know, in one sense, it's so goddamn accidental. I mean, in fact, the first day of Watergate, I had a place up in the woods, a camp up in the woods of West Virginia, and the story was on a Saturday, and I wasn't in the office. I wasn't in the office till the following, 2 days later. And it had beside the fact that it was an intriguing story to see 5 Cuban Latin-speaking guys in masks and black suits and gloves and all and walkie-talkies and all that in there. It was an inherently interesting story, but it didn't take Woodward and Woodward and Bernstein were totally accidental. They were lolling around Saturday morning as the junior reporters that they each were. Great editors will tell you there was a kind of a reporter that if he sees 2 people talking, can't stand it. He's got to get up out of his chair and go over and find out what the hell they're talking about. And both of them have that characteristic. Now, Bernstein, if he wasn't asleep, he also slept a little in the office. The third day, they had located the money. Where was the source of those $100 bills? And the source happened to be from a bank account in Florida that had been a political contribution had been made to the committee to re-elect the president and banked there. And the head of the fundraising committee, CREEP it was called, Committee to Re-elect the President, was a man called Maurice Stans, who was a former White House cabinet officer. And so it was in the White House in 4 days. And the idea was, people said, well, why didn't you take give it to your big shot reporters who wanted it, God knows. But how could you take it away from 2 reporters who were delivering the bacon?
But did you ever, in the middle of all this, stop and think, this is huge, or did you just get on with the story?
Well, we got on with the story and tried to, find out the answers to, we were taking 400 bites out of the cake, and so it was, and that was over a period of. It was in June of 72 to August of 74. There came a time when, as soon as there was one of the judges, he went into the court, one of the judges got a hold of it and then started asking questions. And then there were hearings on the Senate, and the entire country was watching television on those things. You couldn't believe it. You could leave your desk and go up and down a building, and you could hear it in the elevator. You get into a cab and go up to the hill, and you could hear the cab had it on. So you knew that it was going to be a big deal. We banned we refused to allow anyone to mention the impeachment word. Cannot say that in this office because somebody will hear about it, and it will be a story about how the Washington Post reporters are talking impeachment. But it's and then they made the goddamn movie, and you got to watch. I mean, there was a big charity occasion for, they raised money for some charity to have the opening of the movie in Washington. And you've suddenly found yourself, you know, a celebrity, a real celebrity.
Do you have concerns about the current political environment in the States restraining the free press over here with the Patriot Act?
Can't hear.
Do you have concerns about the current political environment in America restraining the freedom of the press?
Well, I don't feel restrained. Well, of course I'm out of there, so, but I don't notice that my successor feels that his freedom is being encroached on. Information, they make information hard to get, but that's not really, it just is a challenge to you to get it. And that can be done. I mean, there are people who are upset about it, and they're, you know, it's impossible to keep a secret in Washington. I mean, maybe some secret about the internal workings of the White House, but if it's more than 3 or 4 people, you know, they go home, tell their wives, tell their kids. It gets out. You don't get it as soon as it happens. But I don't feel that freedom. I mean, they are not an open administration. Anti-press than Jimmy Carter was. You know, after he got in trouble, Clinton was. Clinton is running for president of the United Nations. Don't let him get elected. I don't think he will.
Hello.
I'm sorry.
I was going to ask a general question about your opinion of George Bush and corruption maybe still within his administration. People like Michael Moore, who were attacking him during the Iraq War with the movie,
Yeah.
and the effect that it had on the American people, and whether it really changed anything. And also how when journalism goes wrong, like when Al Gore was declared president on one of the networks, when actually somebody had a word with someone and George Bush actually turned out to be president.
Well, I can't, in the first place, I can't imagine how Al Gore got licked. I mean, it seemed to me that if he should have won, but he had an incompetent staff.
If you look at the Michael Moore movie, he talks about the rigging
Yeah.
of the voting and the processes that we used.
Well,
to get George Bush back in power.
Bush Jr.'s popularity is going down slowly, and the Republicans are beginning to worry about that. That's not going to do them any good. That's not going to do the people who are going to run for the Senate and the Congress, you know, and they'll be heard from. He runs a different presidency. First place, he's out of town 3 days a week, so and much more than any other predecessor. I mean, he goes out and makes a speech here, and then he comes. He doesn't even come back. He jumps here to make another speech the next day, and then a third day, and then he ends up in Texas, or he comes back. And I don't think that you know, it's now. I think that people who run presidents care less about anything except television. They want the guy who ran Reagan was a friend of mine, and he told me, I don't care about you guys. Just don't care. Give me a story for the nightly news, and I'll have the president the way I want him, saying what I want him to say, and believe me, he will look good, and leave it at that. And you know, you whine about it in the editorial pages, but that's, you know, people don't read those. Newspaper circulation is declining, he'd say. Until we knew that television viewership was declining also. But
was there a groundswell of anger towards George Bush post 9/11, and with the media coverage post 9/11? Was there any anger towards the president for what responsibility possibly lay at his door for that happening?
I don't think there was much anger, certainly in the beginning. I mean, there was a kind of a cohesive feeling about the country pulling together, I mean, that's the first time we'd ever been bombed, in effect, and you know, little dribbles on the West Coast in World War II, but I think there was a feeling of cohesion for a while, and now because and terrorism became a separate issue, not having anything to do with Iraq, or you know, not being identified in the public mind with Iraq, and certainly with the Iraq War. So I don't think, trying to think of you know, the Michael Moore criticism was important, and it obviously had an effect, and I think there's more and more criticism. He gets a little bit, you know, he's gotten much more confident since he first came in there, and it seems to me he's dressing a little better, and his shoulders, his suits fit well, and he hunches them up this way, and he looks at the American people, and it appears mini-forceful.
Do you know Joe Frazier's over here at the moment?
I beg your pardon?
Joe Frazier is in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Have you seen him?
Yeah.
Did you know Joe Frazier?
Yeah. Well.
Right, okay, if there's no more questions, there's one more. Make the last one.
Please, excuse me. You were friends with President Kennedy.
I was.
Yeah, do you subscribe to the lone gunman? Or do you
I'm a lone gunman man. One man. It seemed to me, I was working for Newsweek then, and I was in charge of the magazine's effort that one day, and I subsequently, I didn't read the 44 volumes, but I subsequently spent a couple of months really studying it, and to the best that I can say, which obviously I could be fooled, but not obviously fooled. I think there was, God, it's wonderful what happens when the country fails to focus, fails to agree on that, and it is most disruptive. The number of, they can't agree on another theory. One of the most difficult moments for me was when off the streets one day, a guy walks in with a picture. He has three sort of crummy looking men, but clean shaven, who were arrested on the knoll, behind the knoll, which they, at one point, it was argued the president was actually shot and not from up in the teaching place. One of the three looked exactly like a man called Howard Hunt, who was part of the people who had broken into the Democratic headquarters and looked, you know, had been arrested and indicted and served time in jail. And he looked exactly like him. I mean, not just a little, exactly. And I said to myself, holy moly, this is incredible. The guy wanted $7,500 for the picture, and we had never paid more than $100 for a picture. So I said, could I borrow it for a few hours? And took it down to the FBI. And they didn't seem surprised, but they were going to teach me something. And anyway, a couple of hours later, they called me back, and they showed me something about an alternative to thumbprints, which is earlobes. Earlobes and ears are as distinctive as fingerprints. And so they had blown this photo of this person that I called Hunt up, you know, until I had it a big, you know, very with pointers and all that shit. And then they'd done the same thing with the actual picture of Hunt. And it was, you know, it was like comparing Africa to South America. It was just not on. It wasn't even close. So that was the closest I ever came to doubting it. But you know, you can't read 44 volumes. I didn't read 44 volumes, but I read I guess there were 3 or 4 volumes condensed, and I read that. And I've always been impressed that There is the anti-one-gun theory has the people against that have never been able to unite on an alternative. And some of the people were pretty shoddy. Some of those guys who I've forgotten their names now, even. But
All right. Well, thank you, Ben, for your time.
Well, thank you
for coming in, for taking questions at this kind of extended press conference. Ben Bradlee has had a magnificent career. He wrote his book, called it A Great Life.
good
Good
life.
life.
Good.
Good life.
I couldn't say great.
He really wanted to be the managing editor of the Washington Post. He was at Newsweek when Katharine Graham took him to lunch and said to him, "What do you want to do with your life?" And the response is legendary. It might be legend, it might be myth, but the response is always said to have been, "I would do anything in the world to be managing editor of the Washington Post. I'd even give my left one for that job." When you left the Washington Post, perhaps it's another legend, in Katharine Graham's farewell, she recalled that story and ended by saying, "I took him up on his offer." And I think you're pretty good for all that. Anyway, thanks again. We're honoured to have you here, and hopefully you can contribute in that meeting to about New Zealand and New Zealand journalism once you've had a chance to take some of it in. So thank
Good.
you.
It was great to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you all. You're in a good business.
I'm interested in Carol Bishop now.
Which one?
Carol's
You.
coming up now.
My God, I'm next, am I? You've done Margaret.